Good morning. Hope everyone is doing well. Had Were able to enjoy a little bit of extra time on Monday with the university being closed, Victoria Day, and we are on our fifth lecture, or essentially kind of reaching already the halfway point through the semester. It's hard to believe, but I guess that's the summer speed. Just making sure before I'm sort of speaking into the ethos that you can hear me, the microphone is working all right, and that you can see the slides. Should be the title slide for lecture 5. Thank you, Zoya. Okay. Um, yeah, so lots of sort of different little sort of developments since we last saw each other, but nothing sort of new that wouldn't have been flagged already through Quarkus and sort of announcements. Um, Today we have our final pre-midterm lecture that will complete sort of the content for the first half of the class. We'll talk about social inequality, social stratification. Obviously, we have our midterm on Monday. That happens between 9 and 11 on Monday morning on Quarkus. The details of the midterm will be released tomorrow, along with a series of things I laid out sort of in the announcements, but the format, some practice questions, the instructions, and a list of key concepts from the latest edition of the textbook for those of you who are working with an older edition so that you know what content to maybe sort of quickly look up elsewhere. And so you should have everything you need. I also will have 2 hours of office hours drop in on Friday between 10 and 2, between 10 and 12, where you're welcome to come in and have a chat. Yeah, about the midterm or frankly anything else you might be interested in sort of touching base on. So yeah, sorry, and a discussion forum on the midterm that will be open where the students are welcome to share some tips and strategies for studying and also ask questions that their colleagues may be able to help them up with that kind of stuff. And so the midterm takes place through Quarkus. When you log on at 9, midterm starts. I will do sort of a walkthrough, but you'll click through assignment box, and then the questions will be there, and then you will answer those questions, and then submit them directly into Quarkus. You've got 2 hours, and so yeah, it will time should not be a factor. Writing the exam and doing it well should be possible within sort of I'd say about 75 minutes. So the extra time is for yeah, people who take a little bit of extra time, English as second language, break you need in there for a few minutes, or anything else that might come up in terms of, internet disruption, those kinds of things. Um, I think that's it. We do not have a lecture sort of afterwards. Our next lecture would be a week from today, where we start the second half of the content, second half of the semester's content, where we're looking at the topic of work in the economy that will build on the things that we're discussing today. I think that's it that I can think of. Yeah, and otherwise we'll get started with the substantive content. So today we're talking about social inequality. It's a really big topic. Um, in lots of introduction to sociology courses, there might be several weeks that are dedicated to social inequality and on different layers or different types of social inequality. And this course, in a way, is no different than that. We have today the discussion on sort of the social equality sort of more broadly, really kind of tied to social class, to kind of economic resources. And then we continue to talk over the course of the second half of the semester as we talk about work, as we talk about health, as we talk about education, and we talk about crime, about other forms of inequalities that exist sort of in the system and who it impacts most, and what are the kinds of things that have been done about it. The textbook sort of covers a lot of different pieces. So in some cases, I'll move through some of the material just a little bit faster, but in some other cases, this is sort of additional information. So I want to start with the idea that when we talk about inequality, oftentimes the principal piece, obviously not the solo piece, but the principal piece is talking about income or wealth inequality. And income and wealth, obviously not the same thing. We're talking about income. We're talking about the salaries that people are deriving from work. We're talking about wages. We're talking about income transfers, ownership of sort of properties that generate some income from that. Wealth are things like property and buildings and lands and factories and cars, like all the money you have in your bank account, all the stocks, life insurance, everything that makes up somebody's sort of wealth portfolio. And so when we're talking about economics, or we're talking about income or wealth inequality, really we're talking about how well are people off in terms of day-to-day life? Are they working just at sustenance level? Are they working with comfortably in the economic conditions of the time, or are they working with a certain amount of surplus? And obviously, that surplus can go from a little surplus to quite significant amount of surplus, in which case there's lots of disposable income. There's more wealth than is necessary for just sort of surviving and sort of living, and so then there's luxury that kind of comes into play. What we know in terms of Canada is that Canada is considered one of the most prosperous sort of country in the world. And I don't mean like, top one, top two, top three out of the 200 countries, but in the scope of all the countries around the world, there's a high level of economic prosperity in Canada, and it's seen as a very high desirable place to live. And yet, income inequality has been increasing significantly in Canada over the course of the last 25 to 30 years. Some would argue even further than that. The income inequality has been increasing sort of closer to sort of 50 years, but really there's been an acceleration of that. And so what that means is a concentration of more of the income and more of the wealth in the upper ranges of the stratification system. And it means that despite working harder and longer, families' income in the middle class and below, and working class and then below that, are having a harder and harder time making ends meet. And so that income inequality ends up being something that has impact on all these other fields we'll be looking at over the course of the semester, like education, like health, like crime and deviance, like work. And so it matters because it leads to a very different quality of life, but it also matters because it has impact on all these other different aspects of everyday life. So that's just sort of the overall kind of framing. A little bit of data, if we talk about income inequality sort of in Canada, these will change a little bit from year to year, but what we have currently is that the average Canadian income is right around sort of 67,000. The top 10% in Canada are making just a little over 112,000. The top 5% over 147,000. The top 1% over 283, and the median Canadian income is 42. Some of you already know difference between average and median. Maybe a handful of you do not. I guess it depends, whether this has come up in other courses and your degree that you're pursuing right now. But average is the mean. You add the income of all of the Canadians, and then you divide it by the number of Canadians you've counted, and then that gives you the mean. And the median is you put all the incomes of Canadians from lowest to highest, and then you find how much the person right in the middle, like if there's 100 people, how much is the person in 50th or 51st position, how much are they making? And so the reason we used a median and a mean is because having, in that example of 100 people, frankly, we could use an example of 10 people. If you have a handful of people at the top who are making a very large sums of money, let's say millions and millions and millions of dollars, it really pushes up the average. So you could have six, seven, eight people out of 10 who are making anywhere between, 30 and 80. But if you have a handful of people at the top that are making millions, then it pulls the average up very quite a bit. But it doesn't. These outliers don't pull that median up at all. Median is no matter what. In terms of the people at the very top or at the bottom, it always calculates exactly sort of the middle point between the highest income and the lowest income in terms of numbers of people. So in income inequality and things around affordability, in order to look at the affordability for the quote unquote sort of typical Canadian sort of family in Canadian, we oftentimes will look at both the average and the median, those two pieces of information together. I don't know if looking at these numbers, some of you are like, well, this is lower than I expected. I'm going to say that in some instances, the students have expressed surprise that they would have expected that the average is higher than that, but specifically the top 10% or top 5% would be higher than that. Part of that, and we'll look at this sort of in a moment when we look at the cross section between this, for example, and sort of education. Sorry, we'll look at that on Wednesday next week. We look at the intersection between the two, but we are in Toronto in a place where the top 10% and the top 5% is significantly higher than that. This is for the country from coast to coast. And also people who go to college, university, the top 10% or 5% among them is also significantly higher. So if the numbers look a little lower than you would have expected, then that is probably sort of the likely reason. But this is just sort of give an example of what we're talking about. This is a graph here that lays out from 2015 to 2023 the official and what's called the modeled poverty rates. So what we have is the lines are kind of showing that from 2015, looking at a number in the 13 to sort of 15% of people who are around or under the poverty line. Those numbers dropped a little bit heading in 2017. They dropped actually in the 2020, which again might be sort of a little bit strange or sort of a data point. But one of the things that happened during 2020 is COVID. And there was an almost unprecedented amount of government support for large numbers of Canadians who were either out of work or whose work were incredibly impacted by the pandemic. So there were significant monthly transfer payments. And those payments, relatively speaking, are help more the people who have the least. And so it had one of the net effect is it had the effect of sort of helping people move out of relative poverty and see the overall poverty numbers go down to just around 7%. Since 2020, though, things have sort of resumed. And so we have from 2020 to 2023 sort of a slow but steady increase from those lows of 2020 and heading back to where things were in the 2015 and before range, which means sort of in that 12% or something like that. So this speaks to what's called the official poverty line. Now, how do we measure that? Every country has its own definition. I don't mean completely different, that there's no relationship between them, but every country measures poverty in slightly different ways. For a very long time, Canada didn't have an official definition for poverty, but one has been adopted in the last decade and a half, and we use what's called the market basket measure in Canada. And so what the market basket measure refers to is the extent it measures how low income it measures the income of individuals in relationship to a specific grouping of goods and services that are considered what's called a modest basic standard of living. Um, so it's a relative number that says, okay, if you live in Toronto, it's more expensive. If you live in Vancouver or Victoria, it's more expensive. You live in Calgary, it's more expensive. You live in big cities, frankly, compared to rural areas of Canada, it's more expensive. How much does it cost to have a very basic standard of living in terms of lodging, in terms of food, in terms of clothing? And in terms of a handful of sort of basic sort of services that you need to have, this number is calculated by the ESDC, the Employment and Social Development Canada. And so then it's relative to where people live. It's also relative to the size of the family, right? Having a family with four, five, six dependents, that might be a mix of children and maybe some parents or aunts and uncles that a family is looking after. It has an impact because, of course, it costs more. So the threshold represents the cost of these specific items of food, clothing, footwear, transportation, shelter for a reference family of two adults and two children. And so then if somebody has only one adult or has more than two children or less than two children, then that figure is adjusted. So this is the market basket measure. It's considered what's called a relative definition of poverty, and that's how the poverty line, the poverty rate, is calculated in Canada. And then the policies that are there, or the economic upturns and downturns, you're able to monitor from month to month and from year to year. How are Canadians doing as it pertains to this sort of basic standard of living? There's a lot of different factors that are seen to impact social inequality. I will only list sort of a handful here. Colonization is a significant one that we've sort of referred to a couple of times before, but the colonization of Indigenous people sort of in Canada has had an impact on virtually all areas of individual people's lives. And so we have a 11.8% of Indigenous people living off reserve are under the poverty line. In terms of geographic location, we have different provinces, so the rates will change from one province to the next. Oftentimes, again, there's a couple of different sub-factors within that, but one of those factors is that different provinces adopt different policies around things like minimum wage, around sort of the safety net, around sort of services that are available, around, for example, daycare, the cost of schooling, the cost of different sort of social programs. Also, the type of industries that those provinces have and how competitive they are in terms of wages, all of those end up, of course, playing a factor. Ontario usually sits sort of around the middle. Quebec on the lower end. BC here is an example of a province that had a slightly sort of higher number. In terms of the family structure, this is really sort of significant piece. Single parent household in Canada are a significant predictor of being around sort of the poverty line. Whether they're being whether that parent is a man or a woman, but within that, women-led single parent household are more likely to be under the poverty line, 24% versus 18. But so being a single parent, raising children, multiple children, obviously that makes things more difficult economically speaking. And so it's not surprising that you would see an overabundance of those individuals under the poverty line. Work status obviously is one of the biggest factor. When you have industries closing, when you have factories closing, when you have, more recently, we'll talk about that next week, but when you have AI coming into the picture, you have significant layoffs that happens in industries. When there's an economic downturn, more broadly at the level of Canada or even internationally, lots of people lose their job. And so the work status is clearly a really significant impact. Some people are in stable careers and jobs where they are able to navigate the economic downturns while be able to remain employed. And others are more susceptible to losing their jobs when you have economic downturn. So this is a really big factor. There continues to be an impact in terms of being a racialized Canadian in terms of social inequality sort of in Canada. So racialized individuals, 13%. So a few percentage points higher than the average. Education, we'll look at that in a couple of classes for now, but while it's not determinative, it is significantly impactful. So having a completed high school degree, having a post high school degree, having a completed college or university degree, these are all factors that are positively are positively correlated with a better economic outcome. So fewer chances, not zero chances, but fewer chances of being below the poverty line. And finally, people with severe disabilities, who makes it harder for them to maintain and to get and maintain jobs, have higher costs associated with their disability, the extra challenges that are present. They're particularly, again, impacted by economic sort of downturns, and even in any given year, they have a higher rate of being below the poverty line. 18% of the moment where these figures were captured, which is which was in the fall of 2025. So Jaina asked, would also race be a factor? Absolutely. That was race is the fifth criteria here that's mentioned, talking about visible minority status or being a racialized Canadian. Race is absolutely a factor into this. And so there are others that are there. And one of the things to kind of keep in mind is there's an intersecting, there's intersecting elements here, right? So if you combine disability with less education, with a more precarious work situation, and you're a single parent, now you've got three or four, in this case, four different dimensions that become predictors of a higher likelihood of being the poverty line. And so if somebody or a family who has one, two, three, four, these compound one another. And so they make the rates of looking at two or these three together much, much higher. So the statistics I'm providing here, or a little bit of numbers I'm providing here, are sort of separate from one another, meaning it's the whole group within that group. But once you have these intersecting lines, another dimension of the picture really comes into play. That probably doesn't need to be said by now, but I'm going to say it again. There is no element of sort of midterms or finals or testing you on your knowledge of numbers. First of all, there's no memory work because these are open book assessments. But even despite that, even when I'm using in-person closed book exams, I don't test students on their knowledge of specific numbers or specific dates or specific names. The goal is to kind of okay, what's the sense here? And the takeaway from this particular slide is that there's various factors that impact social inequality. So in other words, social inequality is not distributed sort of randomly. Chance, does play a role somewhere in there. And I don't mean to trivialize it. Like the life circumstances of sort of, good luck and bad luck that would fall under chance is a factor in there. But these are sociological factors that have a significant impact on what takes place. So I mentioned earlier the market basket measure and the fact that we didn't have a definition of poverty for a long time. And it's worth taking a pause here for a moment. Like a definition of the poverty sort of matters because it is, while there's many ways of measuring sort of poverty, if there is no agreement on what poverty is, then you don't have policymakers and politicians able to sort of say, First of all, I believe that this is a problem, and B, I believe these are the solutions that ought to be pursued in order to try to, blunt the impact that this would have on working and not working, but on working and non-working Canadians. So the debates for a long time were debates around whether or not the definitions ought to be an absolute definition or a relative definition. An absolute definition would say anyone making under X amount of money is under the poverty line. A relative definition says, well, what can I do with this money, right? Like it takes more money to be above the poverty line in a place like Canada than it does in a number of other countries where the standard of living, where the cost of food and the cost of clothing and the cost of shelter is much, much lower, right? When you travel, if you've had a chance to travel, you know that the currency that you have that you then trade for the local currency doesn't go as far in certain places than others. There are places where you visit where or maybe you haven't had a chance to visit yourself, but you've heard people visit that are significantly more expensive, and then there's places that are much more affordable. So the part of the debate was around exactly how do we measure this. But once there is a measure, then it becomes really important because the politics of it ends up being like what determines the social policies that are being put into place. What are the legislation, for example, for businesses around things like, minimum wage or working conditions? What kind of social safety net do you think is sort of reasonable for people to have? What should they have access to no matter what their income is, right? And those are debates. Different jurisdictions, different countries make different, and frankly, different provinces make different decisions on that. Should people have access to affordable, healthcare? Should they have access to affordable education? Should they have access to affordable legal representation if they get, caught up in the criminal justice system? Should there be some basic amount of income transfer that is sort of guaranteed in order for people to have like basic necessities in terms of just being able to have a couple of meals a day and be able to put a couple of pieces of clothing on their body and be able to have enough to sort of stay somewhere. So we're talking about essentially redistributing income through tax policies. So different jurisdictions make different decisions. How much are we going to use government policy in order to collect and then to invest or redistribute that income either directly or indirectly through services or through transfer payments? And so what we're talking about here is essentially the social safety net, or what's called oftentimes welfare benefits. So that's the definition of poverty. That's a little bit of numbers about what it is. And we had a couple of factors listed that talked about what are kind of the sort of the broad picture things that StatsCan and sort of researchers in the area have identified as related to social inequality. Sociologists go beyond that and are interested in explaining where this social inequality, specifically explaining where poverty comes from. Now, within that, there's two large families of explanations, and one is individual level explanations, and one is structural explanations. And if you remember a conversation about structure and agency from earlier in the semester, where structure is important and we need to be mindful of that because we are not living in a world where everything is just the outcome of individual choices that people make. And yet, agency is important. We need to pay attention to the decisions and choices individuals and family make because they matter in the outcomes of things. We need to look at both. Well, really, again, here we've got these two pieces, individual level explanation and structural explanation for poverty. So individual explanations are the ones that focus on the people themselves and what attributes they have. These studies have been out there for decades and decades and decades, who look at the least economically well-off individuals in a country, let's say Canada, and look at the most well-off individuals in a country. And then they compare these two groups of individuals to one another. And they try to sort of identify what are, if any, characteristics of people who are rich and the people who have relatively little, who fall under sort of the poor category? Can we detect the ways in which the people who have more have like distinctive kind of characteristics? And here, the explanation then, when we go on the individual level side, is the idea that the people who have less because of personal deficits, right? They have less because of inherited attributes. They have less because of things like lower intelligence, or they behave in ways that run afoul of sort of expected behaviors, so in deviant ways. Or they have what's called acquired attributes. They may have lower self-esteem or lower achievement or lower motivation. And people will oftentimes talk about things like lower work ethic. And again, there's been an attempt, because these explanations are so widely believed and so widely circulated in broader public discourse, that there must, like, a significant portion of the poverty picture must be explained by that. And over and over and over again in these studies, the evidence supporting these explanations is oftentimes lacking. It doesn't mean that there's sort of zero evidence, but it is very, 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 very thin. And so a very small amount of the explanation of why people are not doing well versus why people are doing well can be attributed to these kinds of personal level attributes, that the people who are better off are just, they're just harder worker. They're just more motivated. And the people who are at the bottom, at the end of the day, they're there because they lack the work ethic, and they lack the sort of the mentality, they lack the motivation, they lack the drive in order to go from being quote unquote unsuccessful to be successful. So it doesn't provide anywhere near enough of sort of an explanation for the kind of variations we see out there in terms of income inequality. So then the other kinds of pieces, the other kinds of studies that have been done, empirical studies, is looking at structural explanations, right? Which there focuses more on the social organization of society, and how these play a role and contribute to poverty within society. So, what are some examples of that? Well, the economy is an example of that, right? I've referred to this a couple of times already, but the economy goes through different cycles. There's moments of periods of really high unemployment, and often, most of the time, are followed by a correction of times with sort of lower employment. There are times where there is a surplus of jobs and there's vacancies, and it's kind of an employees market where there's lots of different opportunities for people to work, more so than the number of people who are there. And then there's other periods where it's the reverse. For every position that opens, there's dozens, if not hundreds, of applicants, and only one person obviously is able to be successful for any one of those jobs. And a lot of people looking, but the opportunities are sort of not there. So the economy is a really big piece of that. Social policy, minimum wage legislation. We had over the COVID period in 2020 a different example of that. It wasn't minimum wage, but it was CERB, which were these funds that were transferred to Canadians impacted by the pandemic. But it's another example of sort of social policy that creates a higher floor. And so the minimum wage has been going up in Ontario. It's been going up in all the provinces, trying to either stay in place with keep up, sorry, with inflation. Although it's not quite managing that, but trying to stay within eyesight of inflation. Inflation goes up anywhere between 1, 2, 3% per year. Obviously, some years even more than that. And so the value of the same salary from 10 or 15 or 20 years ago is not the same as today. Minimum wage legislation is meant to go up to reflect that everything costs more money. Shelter costs more money, clothing costs more money, food costs more money. But these policies in jurisdictions around the world where you have minimum legislations that is higher versus lower, it does mean that there's a relatively fewer number of people who are operating on just a subsistence level or below subsistence level. Tax collections and tax allocations, and things like neutral tax, a GST, fuel taxes, taxes on consumption goods. That's all part of the policies that end up having an impact. And then things like ideological perspective. It's not the main sort of explanation, but it is an explanation. I spoke to this in the factor for social inequality, but to the extent that there's still some element of prejudice or discrimination out there, you have some groups that are more impacted than others, and there is a portion of the poverty explanation that comes at the intersection between that factor and some other factors. So there strong empirical evidence for the impact of these structural explanations. So for us, then what we have is okay, if the default is in public discourse, oftentimes this idea again of meritocracy, that people who are doing well, it's because they deserve to be there because they worked hard, and the people who aren't doing well, well, it's because they didn't do the kinds of things they need to do, and they're still kind of not doing the kinds of things they need to do in order to lift themselves up economically. And while those decisions and work ethics and talent and all of this do play a role as an overall explanation for the pattern of income inequality that's found out there, it's wanting as an explanation, and much more of the variations can be explained by these structural level explanations. And so what that means is what that points to is the notion of the system. And, social scientists have a term for that to talk about the system tied to resources, and it's the term social stratification. Social stratification is not a feature of an individual group. Social stratification is a feature of a society. It speaks to how different groups of individuals are organized in a hierarchy, so from people who have more, from people who have less, in terms of resources, in terms of how much, it's not just money, but how much access to sort of resources they have. And part of that, obviously, in the end, is the economic sort of piece. So again, social stratification is a trait of society. Social stratification as a feature of society is not doesn't change sort of willy-nilly very quickly from one year to the next, even from one decade to the next. Oftentimes it's something that lasts for sort of generations. Um, Universal but variable, that may end up sounding a little bit confusing, but what we mean by that, and this is important, is that there is evidence of social stratification in nearly in every country, but even within countries, in nearly every social groupings, in every community, in nearly every community, there's an element of social stratification, I mean, there's a hierarchy. But it's variable. What that looks like in Canada versus the US versus Brazil versus Sweden versus Portugal versus Egypt versus Ghana versus Thailand versus China, like it will look different in different countries. What that stratification model is. And one of the things that will vary from one to the next is how easy it is to move from one peg, if you will, of the stratification. If you think about it as sort of a pyramid, because oftentimes the groups at the top are smaller in numbers than the groups at the bottom. So the pyramids oftentimes get what gets used as sort of a visual representation of stratification. How easy is it to move up the pyramid and move from working class to middle class, or from middle class to upper middle class, or from upper middle class to upper class, using the language from Weber. Like how easy is it to move through that? That will be one of the things that will vary from one stratification to the next. And then, again, it's not always just economics. In some societies, the stratification is not just stratified by economics, but in many societies, there's other elements that play a role into that. For example, race and ethnicity. For example, religion, that will come in and play a really significant part in how groups are stratified within society. So it's not just sort of economics, or economic resources sort of thinly or narrowly defined. Um, it involves sort of more elements than that. It involves elements that will fall within characteristics of groups, and then it will also, involve more than just inequality. It will involve stratification and differentiations in terms of beliefs. What we mean by that is living near the top of the stratification system versus living in the middle versus the bottom leads to a different understanding and a different set of beliefs sometimes about the society that you live in. So there's impact just beyond resources, there's impact in terms of how people see the world sort of around them. Why do sociologists care so much about stratification? Because it shows us what is the structure and shape of the inequality in a given society. It gives us the contour of what that is. The other one is the one I just referred to. It tells us about the movement that happens between the various layers. And then it also tells us the how and why dimensions of inequality may vary over time. So if we look at things from a longer perspective, we look at things over many, many, many decades, and we see changes to the stratification. We see changes to the layers. We see changes, fundamental changes sometimes that takes place in a society. Now, this is less the case in Canada over the course of the last 50 years, but there are several societies around the world who have gone through significant transformation. There was some major upheaval. And oftentimes, that there'll be a combination there of sort of it's a major the political infrastructure was turned upside down or was shifted or was changed or was replaced by another one. But really what we're talking about is the impact on the economic infrastructure. So there is like the way in which the economy is working is significantly different than it was before. So not all of that is the result of a political revolution, for example. There might be some like new resources that were found in that given country. There might be a set of natural resources that were present in the country that were previously not considered sort of that were not extractable or were not did not bring back a lot in terms of compensation, and now they do. It could be in the reverse. It could be massive sort of natural disasters or changes to the environment that leads to the stratification changing in a different direction and making life of large swaths of the population much harder. Again, a lot of the changes usually have a political element in nature. So there is an overthrow of a particular government. There's a civil war that breaks out. A country goes from having a relative amount of stability to being, in upheaval by infighting within the country or by fighting between that country and an invading force or a full-out war with another country. These would all and can all have a massive impact on stratification system in a way that's not small changes over many decades, but changes that can happen quite clearly over a really short period of time. And in terms of the studying the stratification, the symbolic interactionists folks look at the way in which these different access to resources between people who are well off and the people who are less so, how that manifests itself in everyday interactions, how people interact in different social settings when you're interacting around somebody who has a lot more power, a lot more resources, a lot more money than you do. And so I'm saying you to personalize it here, but like then other individuals that are there. And how does that play out in day-to-day sort of everyday sort of interactions across the different spheres you'd be sort of walking around in a given week or in a given month? That's another aspect of studying stratification that becomes really interesting. The term for what I talked about earlier, the proper term for the movement piece is social mobility. This is talked about in your text. I'm not going to say too much about it here, other than to say you can have stratification system that are considered more open, and those are considered more closed. When a stratification system is considered open, it means that there's a high level of social mobility. And when a system stratification is closed, that means that there's relatively little to no mobility. And so one of the things that gets talked about is how the stratification system of today has, relatively speaking, more mobility than, for example, feudalism or the aristocracy system of years past. Again, there's still aristocracies in some countries, but in terms of the societies who move from aristocracy to the economic sort of system built around capitalism that we have right now, that there's more social mobility currently than there was. There are more possibilities for advancement and for movement than there was. If we're talking about movement, then we are talking about movement that can be also intragenerational versus intergenerational. So intragenerational is within. That means you in your 20s versus you in your 40s or 50s. Did you go through a significant economic, shift in terms of the income bracket you're in terms of your access to resources, in terms of your leisure and dispensable income? To the extent that there's some significant shift within your career, within your time as an adult, then that's intragenerational mobility. Um, Intergenerational mobility is comparing the situations of the current generation to the previous generation. So, how are your parents compared to your grandparents? How about you and your siblings, if you have any, compared to your parents? And if not now, then, in 15 or 20 years from now, where are you compared to before? So, one of the things that's really important here, when sociologists are using these terms to kind of like make sense of, of trying to study a different society, including Canadian society, is that we are at a moment where we are breaking a streak where for a significant period of time, and I'm talking about like, almost essentially since the birth of sociology, that every generation that came after was a little bit better off or a lot better off economically than the generation that came before. That means that children, on the whole, were more economic prosperous than their parents. This is on average. Within families, obviously there's lots of different pieces that can take place. But if you're looking at the whole of the country, every generation was doing a little bit better. And the streak has been broken because the generation, I mean, you could argue now it's two generations, but the children of the baby boomers, and now the grandchildren of the baby boomers. So I guess you could speak about 1/2 generations. The trend is in the other direction, meaning that because of the affordability costs now, in Western North American, including Canadian context, it's a more difficult and more challenging landscape. Relatively speaking, this generation is worse off economically than their parents' generation. And so the intergenerational mobility, looking through that lens, looking at Canadian society, you would have seen an arrow pointing up for, the better part of 150 years. And now the arrow is pointing down, where people are not as well off as their parents. And I guess in some cases, their grandparents, it depends. I'm using those two terms, the one versus two, because it depends what age we're speaking of. This is true of people who are in their 30s right now compared to their parents in their 50s. This is true of people who are in their 20s compared to parents who are in their 40s. It's a little bit too early to tell if this applies to folks who are younger than that. I guess time will tell. We will see. Um, okay, maybe one more before we take a break, and then see, maybe you can spudge some questions and see if there's any places I can clarify, add some additional details or information. Again, you're always free to ask questions as we're moving through. I do see them as they come in. I'm thankful here that question came in. Fiona sort of spoke to it right away, but nonetheless, it's a good way to sort of interject. You want to pause or sort of take an extra moment or sort of contrast that with another example you have or something of the kind. Your text goes in quite a bit of detail, laying out laying out Karl Marx and his thoughts, and Max Weber and his thoughts. Right, we've come across those individuals before. Karl Marx and Max Weber are two considered sort of founding figures in the discipline of sociology. Part of that is, and even within that, they're very different than one another. But part of the reasons for that is they wrote extensively about the nature of society, the nature of structures of society. Specifically, they were really interested in social class, in the economic structure of society, and their writings were incredibly influential. Karl Marx's writing were, in many ways, it's hard to argue, more influential, certainly as influential, but probably more influential than any other writers of his time. He was inspiring enough that entire political philosophies were developed around his work in a form of communism and socialism, not exclusively his work. There were other writers as well, but he's a really significant figure within that. And to this day, the economic and political infrastructure in many countries around the world have embedded in them these really significant influences from Marx. So Marx is a really big writer who has had an influence, but is worth through lots of social science sort of lenses to examine and understand and try to sort of better get a better grasp on his work. Weber came in a little bit after, essentially sort of one generation after Marx, and he's less known outside of the social sort of scientific sort of world than Karl Marx is. But his ideas, in some ways, has been even more influential within research, within universities, within the production of sort of knowledge. So I'm not going to do a whole sort of 5 or 10 minutes on each of Marx and Weber. I'm going to let the text here speaks mostly for itself. I'm going to offer a brief summary and a kind of a piece of contrast and why it matters to kind of understand where they're coming from. So Marx fundamentally is writing at the very onset, at the very beginning, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. Factories are a relatively new thing. Industrialization is sort of brand new. Urbanization of people moving in mass from rural areas into urban areas and going from, being self-employed, as in like looking after themselves and their own families and kind of working their land or working as artisan, as craftsmen, and then now moving into the city and selling their time in exchange for wages. This is all relatively new, and this led to a really, really significant transformation of people's lives. It led to a transformation of society sort of more broadly. Marx wrote from the perspective of the idea that you have in this early stage capitalism, you have these two very clear set of people. You have people who own the industries, who are the owners of these factories, what are called sort of the bourgeoisie in Marx's term, and then you have the workers, which he called the proletariat. And these two groups are fundamentally opposed to one another. Like their interests don't line up. The owners are hoping and are trying as much as possible to extract as much value out of their workers to maximize their profits, to maximize the economic gains that they're making. And in every concessions to the workers on any level, in terms of time, in terms of wages, in terms of conditions of work, is money out of their pockets. On the other hand, you have these large numbers of workers who are working. They're working very long hours, and who are looking for and would want better working conditions, better salaries in order to be able to live below sort of the smallest sort of basic necessities level and be able to be sort of several notches above that. So for Marx, he saw society as at the time where he was living as these two sets of individuals who had these things in common within, but who had the fundamental sort of disagreements sort of between them. And in some ways, it's difficult to talk about Marx because so much of his contributions are now kind of fully taken for granted and have been taken for granted for over 150 years that it doesn't look like contributions from him anymore. But when he talked about and he really pushed this idea of social class, it's pretty radical at the time. Essentially, what he's saying is, even though two, three, four, a dozen different workers who are working in different factories in different towns who don't know each other, who have different families, who may come from different backgrounds in terms of linguistically, who may have different beliefs in terms of specific religion. Like they may look like they're completely different people. They share this common thing with one another that's really, really important because their lives, their day-to-day lives, getting up in the morning and what happens between the time they get up and the time they go to sleep looks quite similar to one another. Like getting dressed, getting ready, going to the factory, working there for 12, 14, 16 hours, and then going home. Because their lives had so much in common in terms of how they spent their time, he says, like, these individuals, even though they don't know anything about each other, even though it's strangers, it's literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of strangers, they share this thing with one another. And this thing, we're going to call it a class. We're going to call it a social class. Um, and because they share these things in common, they should see and recognize these things that they share with one another. This is called class consciousness. They should become conscious of these things they share with one another, and then they should band together. They should assemble together. They should connect with one another, and they should advocate together for change. What eventually will become, for example, early signs of unions and political parties that are kind of made up of workers or leadership of workers, like that was not quite yet the case during Marx's time, but this is what he saw happening. This is what he thought should happen, and he thought that in the countries where there is a burgeoning democracy, where people got a right to vote, not everyone got a right to vote, but lots of people got a right to vote. Certainly, working men had a right to vote, most of them. They should vote to fulfill their own interests, and if this group, this majority, which makes up like 99% of people who live are in this together, they should vote policies, they should vote governments that are going to enact things that will make sense for that 99%. Um, so that was Marx's contributions. There's a bunch of other layers and there's a bunch of different vocabulary, but really he saw fundamentally the society as having these two groups have different sets of interests, and one use its money and its influence to control the political apparatus. What the other group had going for it is numbers. And because democracy is about counting numbers, they should band together and try to affect change. Weber came in only a generation later, and things already had gone more complicated because there wasn't just two groups anymore. Already, the manufacturing factory sort of had become big enough that you had people who were lifted out of sort of the working group and had been turned into supervisors and managers and directors. There was a burgeoning, small, early, but a burgeoning bureaucracy that needed to be put in place. The owners couldn't run and couldn't supervise everything on their own. They had to hire people who had, the experience and the skill set in order to run things for them. If I was an owner and I own now not just one factory where I can be there on the floor and see it for myself, and with 12 employees, now I've got 50 employee, 100 employee. Now I've got three factories. I've got six. I've got 12. Now I got to rely on other people I'm hiring and I'm paying in order to do a lot of the work. So Marx didn't see that. It wasn't there. Weber saw that and said the biggest change that's going on right now isn't the fact that there's just these two groups fighting with one another, but there is this new thing called a bureaucracy that didn't really exist in this particular way before, but now is everywhere. And this bureaucracy means that you don't have two readily identifiable group. You have many, many groups. You have people who are at the bottom, and then there's people who are one step up and one step up and one step up, all the way until you have people who are entrusted to be, for example, president, or managing director or executive director of like particular branches or particular sort of businesses, but who don't own those businesses. So Weber identified that it is not just economy, that there's other things that play a role. Beliefs play a role. Religion is more important than Marx gave it credit for. When you talk about inequality, you're not talking about just class, but you're also talking about things like status and power. But the main Weber contribution is he saw the complexity of not early stage capitalism, but sort of the next wave, the next stage of development of capitalism that had like this growing, fast growing middle class. Um, Put another way, Weber saw the early days of what's called the sort of the knowledge sector or the knowledge class, or what's called a kind of white collar jobs, in a way that wasn't so apparent or wasn't as apparent when Marx was writing. So these two authors together offer a different analysis. Marx has sort of, his ideas continue to be influential because people continue to look at the framing of haves and have-nots. People who, the few people who have a lot, who have an inordinate amount of influence, for example, on the political process, and who use their power and resources in order to have society adopt sort of policies that are beneficial to them. And you still have large numbers of people who are not always as well off maybe as they ought to be, and who not always are banding together to sort of advocate for the kinds of things they're hoping for, although sometimes that does happen. So the Marxist sort of lens continue to be a lens that's used to kind of make sense of some dynamics in contemporary society. But in many ways, the multi-decade work of Weber has had a more profound impact because his analysis of early stage bureaucracies continue to be incredibly influential in understanding the role that bureaucracy plays for us in the contemporary world. We'll talk about that more when we talk about work um, next week. Okay, I'm going to take a pause here. Give everyone's ears a break. It's 10:10. We're going to resume at sort of 10:15. Any questions you want to put in the chat or in DMs, things you would like me to sort of speak to, I'll sponge those up and then I'll try to answer those when we come back from our break. Okay, see you in a little bit. Couple of questions by DM, and then a question in the chat. I think some of them are, a number of them are about the exam. Um, the details for the exam are coming tomorrow. So I said that sort of at the onset, sort of very top, but the full package for the midterm will be released tomorrow, which means yeah, the format, the instructions, practice, midterm, forum, and a set of key concepts from the textbook for those using an older or an American edition. So between all those things, you should have sort of what you need. Um, I'll provide also some guidance on, like, broadly speaking, what are the kinds of things you want to sort of focus on, talk about sort of the lecture to textbook sort of dynamic. And yeah, share, a few pieces of sort of strategies around, how to get ready. One of the questions that has come up, I don't mind answering that now because that part of it is sort of fully known. The reason I don't have the details for the midterm today is, I want it vetted, so I've shared it. I will get some feedback later this afternoon. I want to make sure that yeah, we're not, this is always good. It's always good practice to sort of do that, to catch if there's anything that doesn't look right or doesn't sound right to a second or third set of eyes. And then I'll be able to sort of push that out to everyone tomorrow. But one thing I can confirm is, yeah, it is definitely open book. We're not using any kind of proctoring software. Um, or anything like that. These are take-home exams. So you're at home. It's a timed exam, but you have access to your notes, you have access to your textbook, you have access to your computer. There's no attempt on my part to restrict that. So the exam is designed with that in mind. It's assessed with that in mind, but it is yeah, it is not closed book. Yeah, the midterm is, thank you. Gosh, yeah, the midterm, and Catherine, the midterm is 2 hours, 120 minutes. Okay, so um, the current version, and you've seen this term before. I almost have to believe that this is not new to any of you, SES or socioeconomic status. This is the contemporary articulation of Weber's work. That while the term social class or class gets used and does get used in sort of broader public discourse, and something that most people kind of have an idea of what that is, especially in the context of talking about working class or middle class. Like those are commonly used terms. And but the term socioeconomic status is a frequently used term by demographers and social scientists, StatsCan when they do their work, and that is heavily influenced by Weber's ideas. And so it refers to classifying individuals or household in terms of their income, in terms of their occupation, and in terms of their education. So it's not just how much money somebody has, but it recognizes that there's some high status jobs that are relatively low paying. There are people who have advanced degrees or degrees that have a lot of what we would call now kind of cultural capital. And yet they don't necessarily come with a big financial remunerations. So education on its own represents a particular form of kind of cultural capital. The job or occupation that somebody has sometimes comes with more status or less status. And then obviously, how much money or wealth or ownership somebody has is also sort of part of it. So socioeconomic status are these three things kind of put together, merged together to kind of create a more holistic picture of what we're discussing. You have a lot of statistics here, but what I want to sort of draw your attention to is the fact that this is, again, it's not the specific numbers that matter, but it's the patterns. And what we're looking at is the post-secondary participation. So post-secondary means after high school participation of 21-year-old Canadians in percentage. So all Canadians, nearly 75%, attended community college or CEGEP. CEGEP is sort of the kind of college pre-university version in Quebec, 33. And then you have 41% for university. Family income, for those who have below 50,000 or over 50,000, you have a gap, 66 versus 79 going in post-secondary education. And then you look at university, the gap grows 31% to 46.9%. If we look at indigenous status, indigenous versus non-indigenous, we've got a 24% gap attending post-secondary education, and it's about, not quite, but double attending university, 23 versus 42. Parents' education. So now we're not looking at income, but we're looking at whether or not the parents have pursued post-secondary education. If they have, some of that, 80% of their kids go on to do so versus 60%. And again, look at the university gap. It's almost double, 24 versus 49. And finally, we have some information in terms of immigration status, first generation, second generation versus non-immigrant. So if we separate those group, 86 versus 84 versus 71. So what does that tell us? That tell us that the population of first and second generation immigrants are on the whole significantly higher rates of post-secondary participation than non-immigrants. And if we look at attending university, again, 57, 53, 37, we have the picture that's laid out here is that much more likely to pursue higher education out of first generation and second generation immigrants. So this table doesn't give us everything, but this table is a set of data, it's a set of numbers that then point in the direction of there's particular factors and particular things that are at play. Income as a role to play, indigenous status would have a role to play, parents' education would have a role to play, immigration status is also would have a role to play, is correlated strongly with some of these things. And so where somebody is in terms of the education piece of the social economic status is significantly impacted by some of the things we've been talking about already, which is these different other structural kind of factors. None of those fall under the category of merit or individual choices that somebody's making, but they fall sort of oftentimes outside of the immediate purview of the individual. The pattern is found out of the structure side of the aisle. So that gets us back to something we've talked about a couple of different times, but the idea of meritocracy, again, it's in your text, but the idea of meritocracy or what's called sometimes perfect meritocracy is the idea that you are at the top of the stratification pyramid or you're at the bottom on the basis of personal merit. And yet, over and over and over again, research shows across various disciplines, but of course, especially in sociology, a persistent link between family advantage and children's educational achievement. And family advantage being measured by SES, by social economic status. So access to education is part of it. The notion of access to education, in Canada, access to higher education is not as costly as it is, for example, in the US, but it's not cheap. There are costs associated, not just tuition. Tuition's part of it, but there's costs associated with delaying entering the workforce and pursuing higher education. So that's a factor. Aspirations. Some kids, and maybe that's you, and maybe it isn't, but some kids from an early age their parents have aspirations for them to go to college or university. They've talked about that. This is a goal that's been laid out there. It's certainly something that's laid out as well within the area of the possible. So it's possible, and all the way to the parents being like it's desirable to the parents saying like it's a must. I don't care what you pursue, but you are going to get a university degree. And of course, there is the version out there of, no, I do care what you pursue. I want you to pursue these particular kinds of degrees. So that is a factor. Time available. We've brought that up a couple different points, including when we talk about education in the very first class. And then human capital, which is sort of the assembly of knowledge and skill that somebody has picked up from their personal life, but also from their schooling, from their friends, from all of these agents of socializations around them that make it more or less likely to pursue higher education. So merit Just as we've said, and I've repeated a couple of different times, the talking about meritocracy as being a myth is not the same thing as talking about merit playing the role. That would be a significant mistake. Meritocracy is a dominating ideology about how the broader sort of public or large swaths of the broader public see or understand the system around us in terms of education, in terms of the economic well-being. The myth of meritocracy is the idea that this is like merit is not the full picture, that people sort of outcomes in school or outcomes in economic well-being in life are not solely determined by merit. But not being determined solely by merit doesn't mean that merit plays no role. It just means that merit is a portion or a factor and it needs to be supplemented. And this is where the empirical data points to, is it supplemented like a little bit or is it supplemented a lot? In the case we're discussing here, quite a bit of the picture is influenced by these structural pieces. You're born to parents who are right around the poverty line, who've never finished high school or who've never gone any post-secondary degree, who do not speak to or do not encourage, and frankly may actively sort of discourage their children from thinking about higher education as something that ought to be achieved, as versus other kinds of career aspirations that they see as more sensible and more realistic. All of these things end up playing a role. Um, and they play a more significant role than just a question of this is somebody that worked hard versus somebody that didn't. When we talk about inequality, a lot of the focus so far has been on the notion of the money or the economic well-being. But as we saw from Weber, there is more to it than that. Power is a really big piece. So I'm laying out just a few things that are on power. We're going to come back to the notion of power when we talk about some of the institutions, large institutions in the second half of the semester. We're going to most explicitly talk about power when we talk about law and the criminal justice system. But power is defined in a bunch of different ways by different academics, by different researchers. This is one widely used definition, which is an ability of individuals or groups to achieve their objectives, to get what they want despite the opposition of others. If you feel like having a banana right now, and all you need to do in order to get a banana is get up and go to the kitchen and take it. That's not really a huge exercise of power because there's not a lot of resistance to that. But you want a particular job, you want a spot on the team, you want a promotion, you want something that somebody else, you want an opportunity to work as an RA for a prof, and other people also want that, but there's a contestation, or you want something and somebody else who does not want to give it to you. They don't want to do it. Like you're in a group of 3 or 4 people, and there's different debates and opinions about what should happen. The person whose way ends up being the way that's adopted, oftentimes that gets defined as sort of an exercise of power. There's micro forms of power that happens in the day to day. A power of a teacher over students, a power of a police officer over citizens, a power of a bully over a classmate. Those are forms of micro power. These powers are oftentimes not permanent attributes of people, but they're very much context-based, meaning the police officer has this power because of the uniform of the position they hold. The bully has this power because they're stronger than the person that they're dealing with sort of in that moment. That won't translate or oftentimes doesn't translate across other kinds of contexts. Macro power or power that is exercised at the more macro level. This is the power, for example, of laws and policies to influence people, to push them to behave in particular ways. When we talk about the power to influence influencers or power of mass media or power of media to sort of shape public opinion, these are macro forms of power. These are oftentimes less visible. In fact, the strongest forms of power are the ones that are unseen, or the ones whose work is done without you sort of noticing. And the reason that's considered the strongest forms of power is because it is it is very much difficult to resist a form of power you don't see. And so usually, if you can get people to do what you want without them being aware that this is what you want, this is sort of the last level of forms of power. Why is power only context based for micro level power? Um, I mean, I wouldn't say it's only micro level power that's context based, but when we talk about micro power, we're talking about individuals. We're talking about power that oftentimes comes with like a role that somebody occupies, and these roles are by definition context based. So the dad or the mom that has power over their toddler, I mean, obviously with disclaimers, their toddler doesn't always do what they want, but they have influence and power over their toddler. That doesn't all necessarily, I mean, that power as a parent doesn't translate once they're out of the parent role and they're interacting with people at the Starbucks or they're sitting in the class taking a course. Like that form of power they have, it's relational. It's based on the context you're in. Your power as a coach may extend beyond the exact sort of specific context to the extent that you can get your athletes to sort of attend class or to do certain things that are not strictly about the sports, but the context is still that's happening because you're their coach. Once that relationship is no longer there, once you no longer have that relationships between the player and the coach, then that power sort of dissipates. The macro forms of power, um, the folks who have an influence on the political infrastructure, the healthcare system, the education system, are oftentimes some of the same individuals and same groups who also have ownership over media platforms, over broadcasts. And so their form of power does navigate across more than one context. So the wealth that's created, for example, that's gained from having stocks, owning a business, being very successful, will and has more of a tendency to carry with it as its influence across different other contexts, across like the interactions you have with a teacher or principal at the school, across the interactions you have with trying to get an internship for a friend of the family in somebody else's business. Like that form of influence is more likely to sort of move. And so that's why the context base is oftentimes more associated, not exclusively associated, Ethan, to the micro piece. But it's a good question. Power is not always top down. It can also be bottom up. And so what I mean by that is we often think about, again, the examples I gave were almost all examples of top-down power, parents, teachers, um, police officers, government. But there is bottom-up power, and bottom-up power is when individuals band together and resist. When citizens in a country have had enough or fed up and they go and protest. They protest a specific policy or they protest an entire government. They protest an entire political infrastructure and they seek for change. And they can be, peaceful protests, and they can be more active or sometimes even violent forms of resistance and protest. But those can be considered oftentimes bottom-up forms of power once you have everyday individuals who band together in order to see some change taking place. Okay, that's a quick sort of walk through the other dimension of inequality. um, Power is incredibly important to social scientists, to sociologists, and really you could read any lectures I've provided already and the ones we'll provide in the second half as is being imbued with power, and I'll continue to try to flag that, sorry, more explicitly. I want to end the last theme for today is looking beyond the borders of Canada. So, there it's always kind of finding that balance of when we're talking about a particular topic. Are we talking about Canadian society? Are we talking about things that have, are immediately applicable to Canadian society, but also have lots of applications to other societies, to other places around the world? You would think that that's the case. I would want to believe that that's the case. But we can also change our framing and say, okay, what happens if we look at inequality not through sort of national lenses, but through international lenses? If we're looking at inequality on a world scale, as versus looking at inequality within the boundaries of one political system or one economic system that's at the level of sort of the nation. So I've got here a graph on globalization inequality. It looks at the total amount of wealth in terms of the world population, and it looks at who owns that. And so you have the people whose wealth range is over $1 million. They have a total world wealth of 191 trillion. And that represents about 45% of the global share. So that's how many people is that? About 1%. I mean, 1.1% if we want to be exact. So about 1% of the population owns about 45% of the world's wealth. This is out of the over 8 billion people we have on the planet. Another 11% of people own another 39% of wealth. These are people whose wealth ranges between 100,000 and 1 million. In some ways, that's a lot of money. Certainly on the world stage, that's a lot of money. In the context of sort of Canadian society as overall wealth, well, that's not usually being considered rich. Um, Having 100,000 in wealth, that's again all the possessions, including property or cars or investments or insurance or all these pieces. That represents 163 trillion. Again, 11% people fit in that bill of the world population, and that's 39% of the world's wealth. Now you have the folks whose wealth range is between 10K and 100K. 33% of the world populations is there. They have collectively about 13.5% of the global share of wealth, 57 trillion. And finally, you have people whose total wealth is below 10K. That's 55% of the world population. So more than half, the majority of the population have less than 10K in wealth. And their total share as a group is 1.3% of the global share. I can't come up with any graph that will do the job of sort of laying out the picture of sort of global inequality as well as this. Um, the mention sort of on the side is the fact that this is accelerating very quickly. That the pandemic led to the fastest acceleration of this trend. The richest 1% grabbed nearly two-thirds of all the new wealth that was created since 2020, almost twice as much as the money of the bottom 99%. And the number of billionaire wealth surged in 2022 because of these rising costs in food and energy and in affordability sort of more broadly. 95 food and energy corporation have more than doubled their profits since 2022. Jenna is asking, would the idea of power also apply to the world of trade? Absolutely. I'm going to get into that sort of in a moment, but yes, we're talking about inequality right now in terms of numbers, in terms of money, but that translates very much into unequal power in terms of having a say over international policies, international agreements, international economic infrastructures. Not all countries are quote unquote created equal in terms of their influence, and governments that have some have more say, and then a really big piece of the picture is multinational corporations, which is not the topic for today. We're going to get into that next week, but multinational corporations have had and continue to have increasingly a really significant influence on the world stage in terms of their level of power. So this global inequality is massive, and this global inequality is growing. So 1.7 billion workers live where inflation is outpacing wages. About 820 million people, or 1 in 10, are going hungry. Women and girls often eat last and least. They make up 60% of the world's hungry population. The World Bank says that there's the biggest increase in global inequality right now since World War II. Entire countries are facing bankruptcy. Many of the poorer countries are spending four times more on repaying the debts they owe, which is oftentimes that debt is debt they owe to the richest countries, than on healthcare. And in three-quarters of the world's government are planning or have fully adopted what are called austerity-driven public sectors cuts, including healthcare and education cuts, trillions and trillions of dollars over the next 5 years. So again, the global inequality picture is falls under the topic of global stratification. There's lots of different elements to that. I'm not doing sort of full justice, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it in the context of social inequality and stratification because that is an important sort of dimension that's out there. And any discussion that we have in terms of the inequality that happens on the Canadian stage is dwarfed by the amount of inequality that happens between the people at the bottom and the people at the top when we look at the world stage. And when we talk about things like advantage or disadvantage, having to do with education, having to do with life expectancy, having to do with health, having to do with all kinds of sort of measures we'll be looking at over the second half of the semester, um, the place in the world in which somebody is born, in which a family lives, is an incredibly influential factor, the most influential factor on these outcomes. Um, the term for the hunger piece, which is not the only piece, but it is one that has a long history of sort of being tracked, and a long history of being a target of what's called developmental work, is called food insecurity. That's the term that's been used to sort of talk about whether or not people have enough access to food for an active, healthy lifestyle. So it becomes a key indicator of poverty and sort of hardship. And so the main causes of global world hunger, obviously, poverty is the main one. Climate change and natural disaster is another one. Another one I mentioned earlier in terms of economic upheaval that's certainly true for hunger is conflict. 60% of the people's hungriest live in conflict affected areas where there's sort of political conflict, again, war, civil war. And then the socioeconomics effect of COVID, and the affordability, like in 2020 and 21, and the affordability crisis that we're in sort of right now, is being felt throughout the world. When we're talking about global stratification, this is a little bit to sort of Jaina's question. We are oftentimes, people talk about, and these are new terms. They used to be called first world and third world. Um, and people have moved away from those labels to now kind of talk more often about what's called the global north and the global south. Um, and it's to describe where the economic kind of concentration of wealth is, in terms of countries, and to a really so high extent, um, the flow of sort of power that's associated with that. So Western Europe, Canada, US, Australia, Japan, um, high standard of living, usually high access to healthcare and clean water, usually stable political structures, as versus Global South, where you've had the role of colonialism, globalization, have created very, very difficult economic conditions for many of those countries. Oftentimes less financial, industrial, or technological infrastructure to be competitive on the world stage. And you have, as part of that, what's called newly industrialized countries, countries who started the industrialization process a little bit later, and some of which are going through rapid economic growth. But they're starting from, it's like a race where they started, well after some of the other countries. So even though they're going fast, um, in many ways, in terms of the world stage, they're playing catch up. There are three large theories to explain this phenomenon of kind of global north and global south, or again, to the question Jaina asked, to sort of like the flow of sort of unequal kind of power through the world stage. I'm going to go through each relatively briefly. This is not the focus, but I did want to sort of provide enough so that you have a sense of the different kinds of explanations that are offered out there. One dominant explanation Not so much by academics, but by sort of public at large, is what is called a modernization theory. And it's the idea that countries are not as well off. This is the same sort of rationale as the individual level explanation for poverty, but at the country level, that the reason some of these countries are not doing as well is because of inadequacies in the countries themselves. And it's called modernization theories because they did not pursue modernization as aggressively or as well or as successfully as some other countries did. They lacked the capital, they lacked the Western business techniques, they lacked a stable government, and really they lacked a mentality that emphasized things like savings and investments and innovations and educations and high achievement and self-control, for example, with having children. So you have essentially the blame for countries not doing as well is countries being poorly run and mismanaged, and having been unsuccessful in what otherwise was an even playing field between all the countries about how they could turn out. And the countries that turn out well did so because they had the right approach, the right mentality, the right techniques, and the right infrastructures. And the ones who didn't, well, it's because of decisions of their own making. So that's the modernization theory. Um, Far more currency in the social scientific sort of realm is what's called the dependency theory, that the Industrial Revolution enabled places in Western Europe and the United States to amass really significant wealth very, very early. Because of that, they were able to establish really powerful armed forces, and they were able to subdue and annex or colonize much, not all, but much of the rest of the world over the span of a few centuries. And so they use their head start in terms of economic well-being in order to conquer and dominate other societies, other countries, and then take the resources from those countries and put them in a semi-permanent state of dependency on them. So over that 250 years, the most powerful countries have impoverished the least powerful countries, not by accident, but by design. Um, Neocolonialism, so that's not the early sort of stage of sort of colonizing a country, but what comes after, created this dependency by having, for example, substantial foreign investment into a country, um, be able to sort of scoop up industries and businesses and capital and land from the countries, supporting authoritarian governments that would keep the borders open. Absolutely, Lola. That would keep the borders open. That would keep the flow of natural resources going to Western countries. That would keep making deals. That would enrich the people making those deals, but into the disadvantage of their own population and debt, making providing funds to developing countries, but with arrangements that all of these funds would need to be repaid, and then using that debt, insurmountable debt, almost impossible amount of debt, in order to leverage power, in order to get these countries to go along with, for example, open borders, completely free market, denationalizing, allowing multinational corporations from Western countries to come in and set up shop, and so on and so forth. And finally, the third set of explanation is what's called sort of world systems theory. That's almost sort of like an iteration of dependency theory, but in sort of the contemporary landscape. And essentially, it talks about how all the economies of the world are tied to one another in one sort of giant global economic system. And what you have is the core, which are the countries who have the most influence. You have the periphery, which are the countries who have the least influence. And then you have the semi-peripheries, which are countries that are sort of in the middle. The argument could be that Canada either represents a core country or semi-periphery country. It depends sort of on what matters. Under some definitions, it's called semi-periphery because we are not the economic sort of superpower that many other countries are. And yet, in terms of political influence, oftentimes Canada carries more weight than the size of its country or the size of its population. So under certain things that might fit core, and other things that might fit semi-periphery. But the idea that you have capitalism but on a global scale. So this is world systems theory is Wallerstein, Emmanuel Wallerstein, if you're interested in this, essentially takes this sort of Marx's ideas about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat and says, let's apply this, but to the world economies. And instead of the bourgeoisie being the owners of industries, the haves are the countries that have all of these resources and all of this influence. And instead of having the proletariat, what you have is the 150 plus countries who are heavily being dictated and pushed around by those more influential countries. There's no better example of that than, frankly, the current sort of like push and shove and back and forth of waves in the economic infrastructure that stem from the current American administration and its use of sort of tariff to sort of change and leverage its influence as an economic superpower to extract better economic conditions out of other countries. Um, and I'm not going to get too much into that. That's more about work in the economy. So we'll look into that next week, but that's certainly sort of part of it. So that's world sort of systems theory. So Faisal, as I said, for Canada, like your Canada, and when we use the language of global north versus global south, Canada is always classified as part of the global north. When we talk about the world systems theory, and we talk about core versus periphery versus semi-periphery under some definitions, which is kind of political influence, Canada is defined as a core country. It's part of the G7, it's part of the G20, it's part of these large supranational organization, which is what this slide is about here. In terms, it has a seat at those table and it has quite a bit of influence. When you're talking about economic influence, economic power, like economically kind of putting pressure on other countries, we're just not there. So under those definitions, under that framework, then Canada is more of a semi-periphery than a core country. So it depends there if we're talking about politically versus economically. But that's very much a good question, and it is very much about the definitions of these things. So the U.S. would be a prototypical example of a core country, sort of on both. Um, and a country like Russia oftentimes gets talked about having a significant impact sort of economically, but maybe less so sort of politically. China probably has, is probably at the top or very near the top in terms of influence, both economically and politically. But if there is a place where they have a stronger influence than to be economically, politically is just a little bit behind. But those things are changing and they're changing quickly, and it depends with whom. There's different clusters of kind of countries who sort of assemble together and try to create resistance, just like talking about workers versus industry owners, smaller countries or countries who've been historically kind of left out, as trying to sort of find ways to create bonds with others so that they have a little bit more of a say. And I don't want to get too deep into it because um, I'm running out of time, and B, these are complex issues that require more than sort of a passing by sort of analysis. But the creation of the European Union was very much an attempt to have 24 plus countries who previously had some element of influence as an economic country and as a political country, but wanting to create a bloc where they would have more influence economically and politically because while there's disagreements between them, they have the mechanisms now to get on the same page and advocate on the behalf of Europe in pushing certain things in certain directions. So that would be an example of of a move that was made in order to gain more leverage on this world stage, both economically and politically. Okay, so my last two slides here are about the state autonomy. So we have this notion that countries get to make their own decisions, but it should be clear already just from the last sort of 10 minutes, not every country gets to make their own decisions. You have increasingly um, 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 political scientists are really interested in this question, along with political sociologists. What is the amount of state autonomy countries have? And this is not true just about countries, quote unquote, elsewhere, but even though talking about kind of the Canadian society, to what extent are the policies in a Canadian context the result of the will of the Canadian people? We talk about what's called a democratic deficit when ordinary citizens are not in charge of large aspects of their governance. So, meaning there's major things that are happening that are impacting their lives that are not the result of the democratic process, but falls outside of that. There's what's called the Three Sisters, which is the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the WTO, the World Trade Organizations. They're organizations that work outside of the scope of countries. They're called supranational organizations. And they're the ones who, while may look on the surface like they're neutral, are disproportionately controlled and influenced by the countries, by the economies that have the most power, the most influence. And these organizations oftentimes are the ones who put pressure on nations to deregulate, to open their borders, to remove price subsidies that protect, for example, local industries, to decrease social spending. In fact, that can be a condition for countries who have a significant amount of debt, that the debt will be, will be reduced in a small fashion or will not be collected upon as aggressively or as quickly if the country cuts their significant chunk of their social safety net. Orient their economy towards exporting so that the whole world, including large corporations, can benefit from their natural resources, not close borders, and really make sure that you have as much privatization as possible. So national industries runs afoul of these processes of the domination of sort of income and the integration of the world economies relies on this notion of private ownership. You can't have countries nationalizing industries and owning the energy sector, owning the banking sector, owning these kinds of sectors. Countries do it, but when they do that, they're running afoul of the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, and the large, successful, well-off countries that see a market close to them and see competition being leveled in a way that they're not interested in. And then the last slide, which is going to connect this to our discussion next week, but individuals as consumers, this is what this slide about, and then individuals as workers, this is what we'll talk about next week, are involved in this. When we say the world economies are tied to one another, it's not just countries putting influence on one another, but the world economy is tied to one another because of the way in which goods and products and services are flowing. You and me and everybody else we know are part of what's called the global commodity chain, right? That what we own, what we wear, what we are listening this lecture on, the computer or the tablet or the phone we're using, like it wasn't all produced in Canada by Canadian workers from Canadian resources, from collecting from the ground to manufacturing process to the selling process to sort of being here. The commodities are produced over a long labor chain, a production chain that crisscrosses the world. And oftentimes those chains are not always transparent and not always known. What is the working conditions of the resource extractions, of the labor and all of this that goes into the products we have? That's not always clear. But the public is part of this global commodity chain. Sometimes the public or some portion of the public pushes back against some of this by wanting to buy local, by putting pressure on supply chains, by being unhappy with the way in which they hear some of the things they consume were made. But consumerism of the West, quote unquote, or of the well-off countries, very much depends on the standard of living and the standard of work in some less well-off countries is what it is. You can't have all these consumer goods that people have in their homes and their apartments and in on themselves without having large swaths of the populations living in the conditions they're currently living in. So when we talk about the term exploitation, actively it's happening by governments and corporations, but passively it's supported by everyone who's involved in consuming most, not all, but most items that we have on a day to day. The lecture reflection for today is how does social inequality persist over time? Use one or two concepts from today's lecture to try to explain your answer. The deadline for that is Friday morning. We're back now that Quarkus is up to the 48 hours or sort of after lecture. So it gives the colleagues of yours who are not here right now on this call to listen to this lecture and be able to submit that in. Otherwise, Monday's the midterm. Tomorrow is the package for the midterm that's going to be released. Friday's office hours by myself for 2 hours to answer any questions you may have. Otherwise, your tutorial starts in 10 minutes. So you have a little bit of a break. The tutorial Zooms are obviously through Quarkus. I will stick around if there's any questions over the next couple of minutes. But otherwise, I will see you, I guess, either on Friday or after the weekend. Enjoy the rest of the week, everyone. Cheers. Thank you, Diane. Have a good weekend as well. A couple of people are saying Martin's tutorial has a password on it. Um, this issue happened with the other TAs when we had our very first week. Just give me a second here. I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to pull. Um, I'm going to pull up my email and write Martin and let him know this so that he has time. Um, why can't I stop sharing?